Today's story is titled Out of Season by J.L. Goodwin. The link to the story is in the description below. Please enjoy. The man was late. Jean-Luc Martel checked his pocket watch for the third time in 10 minutes, watching the hands creep past 11:15. Where are they? He had expected the traveler hours ago, back when the evening was still young. A dozen times over the last hour, he had considered rising from the creaky wooden chair, pulling his wool cap over his ears, and walking back home to his warm bed. But the promise of the payout had kept his boots firmly planted under the table. The stranger's intermediary had promised hundreds of thousands of francs, a staggering, almost absurd sum for a single night's work, and to a lifelong Tropesian who watched his father pull a modest living from the sea. The kind of money was a financial shield against a future he could no longer predict. Ever since the summer of 1956, 2 years ago, when Brigitte Bardot and her film crew had descended upon the central La Ponche quarter, Jean-Luc could feel the invisible winds changing. The growing arrival of Parisians, and now the first wealthy Americans chasing a Hollywood myth, was changing the town. Even now, in the dead of winter, the harbor front was seeing an unusual trickle of international journalists and paparazzi, and the simple wood shack canteen on Pampelonne Beach that had fed the film crew was already morphing into a chic restaurant for the wealthy. Even if the winds of change blew slowly, the signs that the working-class fishing village he'd known as a boy was quietly being bought out by this new jet set were there. The locals and fellow fishermen he dealt with every day told him the real estate prices were already beginning to creep up, and there were rumors the quay would be inundated with large, expensive yachts come as early as late spring. The life he'd always known was coming to an end, and those hundreds of thousands of francs would allow him to tuck a nest egg away before the tidal wave of foreign money completely erased his world. He took a slow sip of the glass of cheap red wine, letting its raw warmth cut through the chill of the room. He was sitting inside Le Cabanon de la Cisse, hidden deep within a narrow back alley near the Place de la Cisse. The tiny maritime tavern was one of the last warm spaces left awake. The air inside was thick, layered with the pungent sting of heavy glouses cigarette smoke, the comforting wood soot from the iron hearth stone, and the lingering rich aroma of a hearty provincial beef stew. Just an hour ago, the tavern had still been loud and filled with the cries of locals who hadn't quite yet been ready to retire for the night. Now, the long wooden tables lay empty with scattered plates and glasses. There was only a single late-night straggler remaining in the far corner, a local drunk snoring softly over an empty glass of pasties. Outside, a biting 4-degree winter breeze whistled through the bare trees of the alley, a crisp coastal wind that would certainly make the open beaches feel bitter and biting. The only thing that sheltered them from it was the narrow, ancient buildings. The heavy wooden door suddenly groaned on its iron hinges, cutting through the low hum of the hearth. Jean-Luc sat up straighter as Francois, a wary older man wiping down the bar, looked up with an annoyed scowl. The night mistral rolled over the threshold in a quiet, chilling wave, and with it, the long-awaited handoff had finally arrived. Michel was the first to hurry inside. The older driver stepped quickly into the warmth of the room, his eyes darting across the empty tables until they locked on the far corner. Spotting Jean-Luc, he offered him a tense, jerky wave before turning back to stare into the dark alley outside. After a moment of silence, entering with a slow, soundless grace, came the stranger. With a dull sense of surprise, Jean-Luc realized he was incredibly tall, about 1.8 meters at least. The moment his long wool overcoat cleared the frame, Michel slammed the heavy door shut, eager to block out the biting wind before Francois could voice his annoyance. It wasn't quite enough, though.
"We're closing in 5 minutes,"
the old man barked, tossing down his rag with a heavy scowl.
"Don't worry, old friend,"
Jean-Luc called back, keeping his voice smooth to ease the tension.
"We will be out of here before you dim the lights."
After a long look, the man gave him a nod, then returned to his work, shooting a glance at the still sleeping figure he'd have to rouse in a moment. Michel approached the table, his heavy boots echoing over the floorboards. He reached out to shake his hand, noting the other man's grip was tighter and colder than usual.
Good evening, Jean-Luc.
Michel muttered, wiping a bead of cold sweat from his brow.
Good evening, Michel. How was the drive from Cannes?
Jean-Luc asked, pulling out a chair for the other man, to which it was received by a quick shake of the other man's head. He noticed a strange, jittery energy vibrating beneath the older man's usual stoic demeanor. He chalked it up to the grueling 2-hour trek along the dark, winding coastal roads in the dead of winter. But the man's eyes kept darting towards the traveler standing just behind his shoulder.
It was long,
Michel said shortly. He stepped aside, gesturing to the tall figure beside him.
This is Monsieur Arthur Vance.
Hearing the distinctly Angelican name, Jean-Luc's mind instinctively switched gears. Either a Brit or an American. He prepared to use the broken, heavily accented English he'd picked up from the Allied soldiers during the war, but before he could utter a single word of welcome, the stranger offered a warm, polite half-smile.
Good evening, Monsieur Martel,
the man said. Jean-Luc blinked, caught completely off guard. The stranger hadn't spoken in English. He'd spoken French, and not the clumsy, chopped-up sentences of rich tourists, but a dialect so smooth, hyper-correct, and immaculate, it sounded like the radio broadcast from Paris.
Before you ask, I'm an American,
the man added, having noticed his stunned expression.
From New York.
Plastering a mask of composure onto his features, Jean-Luc managed a polite nod, hoping it masked his surprise. To the working-class people of the Riviera, the post-war influx of Americans had a distinct reputation, and not even a remotely pleasant one. Loud, boisterous, flashing heavy wads of greenbacks, and utterly refusing to learn a single syllable of the language. But this man, on first impression, was a total contradiction. He was quiet, impeccably dressed, and spoke the native tongue with a flawless precision.
An American,
he repeated, leaning forward.
What exactly brings an American to... Forgive me, gentlemen,
Michel cut abruptly, his voice sharp and uncharacteristically rude. He didn't even look at the American, his eyes glued to the floorboards, as if he spotted buried treasure beneath them.
I am deeply tired. The Mistral is picking up, and as the hotels are all closed, I have no choice but to make the long drive back to Cannes tonight. Monsieur Vance, if I could be paid, I must leave.
Jean-Luc's eyebrows shot up. He had known Michel for years as a patient, professional driver who practically worshipped wealthy tourists for their tips, even the rude Americans. To see him acting this abrupt and dismissive, even under a guise of exhaustion, was bizarre. Arthur didn't seem bothered by the rudeness of it all. He merely nodded, a slow, calculated movement, and reached into the pocket of his pristine wool overcoat. He pulled out a neat, crisp stack of folded bills and extended them to the man. Jean-Luc watched the exchange closely. He vaguely noticed a strange, involuntary hesitation in Michel's arm. The man looked almost wary of reaching out, as if he was too afraid to touch Vance's skin. But before he could even begin to process the odd behavior, Michel snatched the money and after a moment, turned and gave him an odd, almost intense look. Turning on his heel, he vanished out into the night, the heavy wooden door clicking shut behind him. Jean-Luc was left alone at the table with the American, the low hiss of the iron stove filling the sudden vacuum. After a long moment of silence, he turned back to Arthur. The American spared a brief glance at the closed door before turning back to him, shrugging his broad shoulders.
I have to confess, I am entirely unsure why he has been acting so on edge the entire night,
he said, his tone dripping with a pleasant, casual charm.
I noticed it the moment I stepped into his car in Cannes. I suppose some men are simply not built for driving the dark roads.
God knows I'm one of them. Jean-Luc nodded politely, allowing the explanation to soothe his lingering doubts. I should send Michel a telegram in the morning, he thought, just to ensure he made it back safely, and to make sure he has not had a fight with Bernice again. Shrugging the behavior off for the moment, he returned to the question that had been cut short. So, Monsieur Vance, you have come a very long way from New York. What exactly brings an American to our quiet little corner of the world in the middle of winter? Arthur let out a soft, knowing snort, as if he'd anticipated the question from the very beginning. I saw the village, and in God Created Woman this past October, he replied smoothly, using the film's English title. I wanted to see the architecture for myself, take in the atmosphere before it changes. I've managed to lease a room in a private home over in the La Ponche district, very close to the beach where some of the scenes were filmed. I simply need you to guide me there through the streets and alleys. Hearing the film mentioned brought back a sudden, bitter pang to Jean-Luc's chest. The quiet, working-class pride of St. Tropez was already being reduced to a backdrop for films. He offered a polite but tight smile, trying to interject some local humor into his response. Ah, well, monsieur. If you are walking into La Ponche, hoping to catch a glimpse of Brigitte Bardot herself in the morning, you would have been better off staying back in Cannes. While she comes to visit often, she was here just a few days ago for the birthday party of some jazz guitarist. She lives in a grand villa hidden in the hills, not on our docks. Arthur laughed, a rich, hearty sound, and shook his head. Do not worry, Monsieur Martel. I am not some kind of stalker. I merely wish to appreciate the village and its rich history. Jean-Luc froze for a fraction of a second, his mind snagging on the sentence. The word the American had used, stalker, in the manner he had, sounded completely out of place. The word, as he knew it in English, was strictly a hunting term, used to describe a woodsman quietly tracking a deer through the timber and brush. Using it casually in French in relation to an actress was an impossible linguistic construction. It made absolutely no sense. He stared at Arthur, a wave of profound confusion washing over him as he noticed something else. Up close under the warm, yellow flow of the bistro's bulb, he focused on the man's clothes. The heavy wool overcoat and the fedora weren't just clean, they were utterly flawless. The fabric had no creases from a long transatlantic flight or voyage, and seemed to smell more sharply of chemical processing than the musty leather of a traveler's steamer trunk. You must have used an English slang term that doesn't properly translate to our language, he rationalized to himself, forcing a slow exhale. And a wealthy American from New York certainly has the money to buy a brand new wardrobe just for a holiday in France. Before he could dwell on it any longer, a loud crash shattered the quiet. Behind the bar, Francois slammed a heavy wooden club against the mahogany, intentionally making as much noise as possible as he tried to rouse the snoring, passed-out drunk in the corner.
Time to go, gentlemen,
the old man barked.
I'm turning off the stoves.
Jean-Luc took the cue, draining the last drop of his wine. He stood up, pulling his wool cap tightly down over his ears.
Good night, old friend,
he called out, nodding politely. He turned towards Arthur, gesturing towards the exit.
After you, Monsieur Vance. Let us step out into the mistral.
The moment they stepped outside, the biting night air smacked them across the face. The alley was dark, illuminated only by a faint, yellow-tinted street lamp further down the cobblestones. Arthur paused, reaching into the breast pocket of his coat once more. He withdrew a thick stack of bills and pressed them into Jean-Luc's palm. This is half of the agreed payment, he said, his voice cutting through the whistling wind like a knife through butter. You will receive the remaining half the moment we arrive at the threshold of the house. Jean-Luc's thumbs brushed over the heavy wad of bills, his heart doing a grateful flutter. It was real. The only thing is, Arthur added, offering a slightly apologetic, sheepish half-smile. I don't know the exact street or address of the property. The owner only provided me with a vague description of the outer facade. But do not worry. I was assured that I will know it the moment I lay eyes upon it. Jean-Luc pocketed the small fortune as he nodded absent-mindedly, a wave of profound relief washing over his exhausted frame as he began to walk. He couldn't help but let his mind drift into a pleasant daydream. Aside from his financial safety net, a small fraction of the money could be used to finally woo Gabrielle, a beautiful local woman from a neighboring fishing family whom he'd fancied for years. He could now afford to take her out for a proper dinner of fresh sea bream, followed by jazz music and dancing at one of the newly opened lounges down the coast, showing her he was now a man with a future. A sharp, violent commotion shattered his thoughts. Both men turned back towards the tavern in time to see the heavy door fly open. Francois was forcefully hauling the half-roused drunk out into the dirt, shoving him unceremoniously down onto the cobblestones. Before the drunk could even begin slurring out curses, he slammed the door shut and locked it, the iron bolts slamming home with a definitive thud. The tavern's windows immediately went dark. Jean-Luc shook his head with a quiet chuckle, pulling his collar tighter against his neck and turning to Arthur.
Well, Monsieur Vance, let us begin,
he suggested, his boots clicking against the stone.
We will walk across the Quai Jean Jaurès. Even in the deep dark of winter night, the harbor front is beautiful. You will be able to see the outlines of the fishing trawlers and the view out across the black waters of the bay. That sounds absolutely perfect, Monsieur Martel, Arthur replied, gesturing himself. Lead the way. Their boots kept a steady pace, the sounds a dull, comforting rhythm against the dark ground. The exhaustion from the long day was a physical weight pressing behind Jean-Luc's eyes, and he desperately needed to keep talking more to starve off the sleep, exacerbated by the alcohol than out of any genuine curiosity. So, Monsieur Vance, he began, his breath shooting out ahead of him in a faint white cloud. What is it that you do living back in New York, to afford a grand holiday in France during the quietest months of the year? The American maintained his easy stride beside him. He paused for a beat, a tiny, calculated delay that the man barely registered before answering. I work at a telecommunications corporation. Infrastructure mostly. He waved a gloved hand through the air, a dismissive gesture that shooed the topic away like an annoying fly. But it is merely a means to pay the bills, you understand. It is not my true passion, my true love. Before Jean-Luc could ask him what his passion was, the tight walls of the back alleys and side streets suddenly gave way, and the men stepped out onto the wide open expanse of the Quai Jean Jaurès. The famous harbor front was a stark ghost town compared to the chaotic summers of his memory. The empty docks stretched out into the dark, housing nothing but the resting silhouettes of fishing trawlers and small paint-peeled dinghies. The dominant sounds of the night took over immediately, the sharp, rhythmic slapping of the Mediterranean against the hulls, and the lonely, hollow whistling of the winter mistral wind whipping over the roofs of the buildings around the quay. Arthur stopped at the edge of the stone wharf. He threw back his head and let out a slow, appreciative whistle, looking around with an expression of genuine, almost boyish fascination. You were right, he murmured, his voice rich with satisfaction. It really is beautiful. Jean-Luc smiled, a spark of local pride warming in his chest. Maybe the American isn't so bad after all, even if he is here because of the film. He prepared to reply, to tell him about how his father used to tie up their small fishing boat on this very dock, when Arthur's demeanor shifted instantaneously. His features hardened, looking out across the empty water as a cold, sharp sneer cut through his polite expression. His flawless French vanished as he switched to his native English, muttering a sentence under his breath in a low, detached hiss that he clearly hadn't intended for his guide to hear.
Looks a hell of a lot better without all the oversized fucking statues yachts clogging up the harbor. Jean-Luc froze mid-step, his mind scrambling to translate the fast, harsh foreign words. Thanks to his time with the Allied troops, he understood the words perfectly. But the casualness with which he swore, and more importantly, the concept left him utterly bewildered. Status yachts? Clogging the harbor? In the previous summers, only a tiny handful of wealthy industrialists and old money aristocrats even brought their luxury pleasure yachts to St. Tropez during the peak of July, and even then, they were modest wooden cruisers. The harbor was a place for fishermen. There were no oversized yachts dominating the town. The sheer venomous coldness in the American's voice, combined with the bizarre, nonsensical, swear-laden statement, sent a sudden, icy shiver straight down his spine. For a second, Michelle's jittery, sweating behavior back in the tavern flashed vividly in his mind. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with this man. Anxiety tightening in his chest, Jean-Luc swallowed hard and forced his eyes back to the way ahead. He didn't want to chat anymore. He didn't care about the American's passion anymore, or his strange, bitter rants. He simply wanted to hurry through the dark town, drop the stranger off at whatever hidden house he had leased a room at, and pocketed his remaining fee, and run home to the safety of his bed. "This way, monsieur," he said tightly, his voice strained as he steered them away from the open water and back towards the deep shadows of the stone alleys. They plunged deep into the labyrinth of the old La Ponche quarter, where the stone alleys narrowed so aggressively that the sky above them was reduced to a silver slit of stars. He stepped back quickly, intentionally trying to stay 2 steps ahead of the American, desperate to maintain his distance. But his mind was beginning to fracture. These were alleys he had sprinted through since childhood, streets he normally knew like the back of his weathered hand. Yet, in the suffocating dark and the oppressive silence, the corners began to look unnaturally identical. "You have grown remarkably quiet, Monsieur Martel." Arthur's smooth voice drifted from the dark shadows directly behind his shoulder. "Is everything well?" Jean-Luc felt a sudden, icy knot twist in his chest. For some reason, though he couldn't see the man's face in the dark, he could feel him smiling. He swore he could almost hear the faint, sickening amusement in his tone, as if his growing discomfort were a source of private entertainment for him. "I am simply tired, Monsieur Vance," he lied, his voice tight as he forced his feet forward. "I am trying to concentrate, so I do not take us down a dead end." "Ah, exhaustion," Arthur mused, using almost the exact cadence Jean-Luc had when he himself had begun a sentence with the same words, as his footsteps echoed with perfect, unfailing synchronicity behind him. "Whenever I find myself weary, I always find it remarkably helpful to listen to someone else speak. It keeps the mind from drifting off into the dark. If you like, I can talk for a while, to pass the time." Jean-Luc swallowed hard, his throat dry. He didn't want to hear the man speak anymore, not a single word. But his instincts told him to placate the stranger at all cost. "As you wish, monsieur," he mumbled as they passed another offshoot. "Excellent," the reply came, the tone warming with an artificial, practiced cheer. "Let us play a game. It is a little amusement I used to play with my companions when I was a boy. We would imagine what the future would look like. Say, 60, 70, even 100 years from now." Jean-Luc didn't reply, keeping his eyes glued to the dark cobblestones ahead. "At first, one imagines grand things," Arthur began, his voice taking on a detached storytelling quality. "Flying vessels, grand cities reaching the clouds, colonies on distant planets. The usual nonsense. But if you look closer, the details are far more intriguing and fascinating. Think of it, Jean-Luc. Telephones that require no wires. so small and flat they slide right into your trouser pocket. Televisions as thin and light as a pane of glass, hanging from a wall in every bedroom because of how affordable they become. Medicine that can heal any ailment, and perhaps even put a stopper in death itself. And perhaps, if the technology allows, the ability to slip through the fabric of time itself, to travel back and visit any time in history whenever one pleases. For a brief second, the American's voice sounded genuinely wistful, drifting off into the cold winter breeze. But before Jean-Luc could even process the absurdity of any of the statements, Arthur's tone mutated. The warmth vanished, replaced by the same bitter, venomous rasp he had when speaking English back at the port. "But the people who inherited it all," he hissed, his words coming faster now, the cadence of his voice changing into a style Jean-Luc had never heard before. "Future people. I cannot stand them, the little shits. They're weak, fragile, parasitic things. They ruin every magnificent thing they touch, tear down every beautiful thing in this world, and try to justify it. They cluster together like insects, watched over by invisible eyes they call protection, driving the few sane minds left completely insane." Jean-Luc's breathing turned shallow and panicked. He accelerated his pace, his heavy boots practically striking the stones. But no matter how fast he walked, Arthur remained exactly 2 paces behind him, his breathing completely calm. "And the weaponry, Jean-Luc," he continued, a terrifying, gleeful edge bleeding into his voice. "Imagine the guns they will invent. Black steel shotguns that pump with a brutal mechanical slide. Rifles that fire an entire magazine with a single pull of a trigger that can tear down a dozen men to pieces in a single heartbeat. And the blades, magnificent. Heavy knives with jagged, serrated teeth, designed to catch on bone and rip the meat right out of a man." Jean-Luc felt a tear of cold sweat run down his temple. His mind was screaming at him that he was walking through the dark with a madman. "But my favorite prediction," Arthur whispered, his voice dropping into a low, intimate purr that felt dangerously close to his ear, "is the science, the forensics. In the future, the authorities will be able to map a man's blood. They will read his unseen prints on the glass. They will have cameras on every street corner, recording every shadow. It's both brilliant and infuriating. Imagine how so very difficult it will become to get away with a crime, a robbery, an assault." He paused, letting the silence of the old quarter stretch out for one agonizing second that made Jean-Luc's heart feel as though it were about to burst out of his chest. "A murder." A soft, chilling chuckle vibrated from the American's chest, sounding as though the devil himself were laughing from just behind him. Panic officially broke through his discipline. Jean-Luc's eyes darted frantically up towards the towering stone facades of the houses around them. He looked desperately for any hint of salvation, praying to see a single yellow light glowing behind a curtain, a shutter swinging open, the heavy wooden door of someone unlocking. He wanted anyone to look out, to see him, to save him. But as the distant toll of the church bell told him, it was midnight in the dead of winter. The village was completely, utterly asleep. Every wooden door was locked tight. Every window was dead, black eye. He was entirely, hopelessly, alone. In the pitch-black maze of his own town, with him. He was practically at breakneck stride now, his boots hammering a heavy, frantic clapping against the stone walls. His breath tore from his throat in ragged white plumes. And then, a thought. A cold, jagged shard of truth forced its way through his panic and slammed home into his brain with the force of a physical blow. He stopped dead in the middle of the alley. Behind him, The steady clicking of the American's pristine leather shoes ceased. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. A tomb. Jean-Luc's mind was racing, throwing itself backwards through the night like a film reel unwinding. He flew back to the warm, smoky safe air of La Cabanon de l'Assis. He saw the wary, sweating face of Michel. He heard the older driver say the man's name, Monsieur Arthur Vance. He remembered the tall stranger stepping forward, offering the practiced half-smile, and saying, "Good evening, Monsieur Martel." Monsieur Martel. A cold, greasy wave of pure terror washed over him, turning his joints to water. He had never told the American his name. He had been sitting in the corner waiting. Michel had walked up, introduced the stranger, and before anyone else could speak, the man had greeted him by his last name. He knew who he was. He had known before he even set foot in Saint-Tropez. Mon Dieu. Behind him, in the dark, a low, malicious chuckle vibrated through the crisp air. It wasn't the polite, boyish amusement from before. It was the sound of a predator watching its prey slide its foot directly into a steel trap. "Is something the matter, Jean-Luc?" Arthur asked, his French still smooth, but the warmth entirely stripped away. "Why have we ceased our progression?" Jean-Luc was unable to play the game any longer. He was unable to pretend he was simply a tired guide leading a wealthy tourist. He kept his back turned, his body shaking violently under his heavy wool coat. "How did you know my name?" he whispered, his voice cracking in the silence. "I never told you. Michel never told you. So, how do you know who I am?" Another chuckle came from behind him. It sounded hollow, wet, and completely unhinged. When the American spoke again, his immaculate French was completely gone. In its place was his native English, but the cadence, the slang, and the sharp, arrogant style of the delivery was completely foreign to Jean-Luc's ears. "Ain't that a fucking mystery, Jean-Luc?" The voice purred from the dark. "I would tell you, but honestly, spoilers." The sheer, bizarre alienness of the words made the Frenchman begin to shiver uncontrollably. The proximity of the threat was too much to bear. He could no longer stand having the man, the demon, directly behind his back. Steeling himself, extremely slowly, he turned around. The alley behind him was empty. Arthur Vance was gone. The tall, pristine silhouette had completely vanished, as if he had dematerialized directly into the gray stone walls and the gloom. But the empty space brought no comfort. Instead, the sudden absence of the man was infinitely more terrifying. Every shadow, every familiar alcove, every narrow offshoot of La Ponche that Jean-Luc had played in as a child and felt safe in his entire life, now felt twisted, hostile, and threatening. The very architecture of his home had turned against him. And then, out of the deep black void of a neighboring archway, a menacing whisper drifted to his ear, slicing through the whistling mistral like a snake's hiss. "Run!" Some time past midnight, the silence of the La Ponche Quarter was violently shattered. A series of terrified, tearing shrieks erupted from the deep maze of the stone alleys, tracking through the cobblestone streets like a frantic, desperate animal. The sound was so raw, so utterly unearthly, that the more superstitious residents lay paralyzed in their beds, pulling their heavy quilts over their ears and praying against a phantom they could not name. A few of the braver fishermen threw open their wooden shutters, squinting down into the gloom that stretched between the infrequent street lamps. But the corridors below them lay empty. They could only listen as the screaming retreated further into the labyrinth, moving rapidly towards the water. Eventually, the cries reached the Plage de la Ponche. There was a brief, violent commotion, the chaotic sound of splashing water cutting through the whistling wind, and then absolute silence. the night returned to its quiet, average winter freeze, as if nothing had happened at all. When dawn broke under a cold, overcast Mediterranean sky, the village was met with pure horror. A local fisherman heading out to pull his boat into the water for an early fish found the body of Jean-Luc Martel floating face down in the shallow, freezing tide of the beach. He had drowned. The local gendarmerie were called immediately. It didn't take long for the investigation to trace Jean-Luc's final hours back to the Le Cabanon de la Cisse. The wary proprietor, suddenly pale and trembling, told the authorities everything. The long wait of Jean-Luc as the hours went by, the sudden arrival and jittery departure of Michel the driver, and the tall, impeccably dressed American who called himself Arthur Vance, the man who, contrary to so many other Americans, spoke a flawless, chillingly perfect French. The police set out across the region to locate the stranger, locating and interviewing Michel, but it was as if Vance had never existed. There was no record of an American by that name checking into any local home, boarding house, or grand hotel from the Cannes to Saint-Tropez. As the days bled into weeks, a quiet, tense panic gripped the town's officials. Brigitte Bardot's film had put them on the global map, and the coming summer of 1958 promised an unprecedented influx of international wealth and prestige. Terrified that a brutal, unsolved murder would stain the village's burgeoning reputation before the historic season could even begin, the authorities made a calculated decision. They quietly withheld the details from the regional newspapers. Jean-Luc's body was buried in the cemetery overlooking the sea, and his death was buried under bureaucratic silence. His tragedy erased so the town would become a wealthy playground. The residents locked their heavy wooden doors and shuttered their windows every night for months, terrified that the phantom in the dark would strike again. But it never did. As the years bled by into decades, a few curious and desperate souls, unable to let Jean-Luc's memory fade into obscurity, decided to look for answers on their own. They never found a single whisper about an American named Arthur Vance. What they did find, after years of quietly digging through dusty foreign and national archives, confused some and chilled others to the bone. A missing schoolboy vanished from the streets of occupied Paris in 1942. A young couple found butchered in their locked London home in 1931. A wealthy woman thrown from a stone bell tower in Rome in 1897. The records spanned decades, even centuries, continents and languages, but they all shared a single, terrifying thread. Every victim had last been seen in the company of a charming, impeccably dressed foreigner. But it was the final detail that was the most chilling. In every report, the physical description of the stranger was exactly the same.